Believe it or not, this is session 31 in this nearly monthly series that we've been doing for almost 3 years in Worlds of Speculative Fiction. So this time we have Jack Vance's Dying Earth series. This is the omnibus that we were talking about a little bit before. It's got the 4 Dying Earth stories, novels in it. Well, actually not even novels, because the first and the last are essentially a whole bunch of things put together. So collections of short stories and then 2 novels, I guess you could say, in the middle of it, and written at different times, but very important for Vance's work. And the only thing that I created for today was actually the timeline, which is quite long because Vance lived into his 90s and was active even into his 90s. So what we do in this is talk about world building and the setting and then philosophical themes. I have some picked out, but I know that you guys will have some as well that you want to talk about. And there's a lot of biography to talk about with Vance himself, quite an interesting guy. And then there's quite a bit to say about the characters and just what exactly is the Dying Earth and what makes it distinctive. So I think you guys can tell me what you read. I know I encountered Vance when I was in high school. And was reading short stories. I think I'd read some of his stuff already in some anthologies, and I encountered some of the Dying Earth stuff back then, and then left it alone and came back to it again. I think this was something that somebody else had suggested too for the series. I don't remember exactly who, and I'm happy to do it. It did take a bit to get into. The first book I found, going back to it, The Dying Earth itself, took a little bit to get moving with it. In part, one of the things you'd brought up last time was with some of these authors, they throw so many words at you in such complex arrangements that at times, unless you have the time to actually really sit down with it, it's not light reading. But then after you get used to it, then it starts moving along a bit. So Vance himself, let's talk about his biography first. He is a Californian, and he's born in San Francisco. His dad was apparently a rancher. Does not stick around long. It's hard to tell exactly whether they divorced or just separated, but his dad goes down to Mexico and takes off, and so his mother moves him and his 4 siblings down to their grandfather's California ranch near Oakley, up in these nice hills. And he's a really precocious kid. He enters high school age 11. They would let you do things like that back then. The year that he graduates from high school, his grandfather dies, and that's a big catastrophe for the family because you notice it's right in the start of the Depression. The grandfather is the main source of income, so Jack is out there at age 15, taking a whole succession of jobs, traveling from place to place in California, the way I think a lot of other people were as well. A few years later, after working a number of jobs that he didn't particularly care for, he gets a small scholarship and he starts studying at the University of California, Berkeley. You notice that he doesn't just stick with one topic, he jumps around quite a bit. He actually doesn't stay in school that well. He does 3 semesters, and then he decides he wants to go and do something else, so he goes to Hawaii, and he's at Pearl Harbor working as an electrician's assistant, and he said it was pretty terrible, so he left, and it's kind of fortunate that he did because he wasn't there when Pearl Harbor got bombed. Then, after Pearl Harbor gets bombed, he tries to enlist in the Navy, but his eyesight is bad, so they won't take him, and he starts working in the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond. He does enroll in an Army intelligence program to learn Japanese. He does learn some Japanese, but he doesn't finish the program. And then he joins the Merchant Marine, and there's a little story about how he managed to do that. He actually memorized the eye exam. he knew what the eye exam would look like, so he went in and he found an optometrist, whatever it was, and then went in and took the eye exam, and they let him in. And while he's in the Merchant Marine, he starts having a lot of time on his hands. He's at sea, and so he starts writing stories, and some of them are these stories that will be the first ones in the Dying Earth. And then he starts, once he's out, he starts publishing stories. His career was kind of mixed into the 70s. He wrote for a lot of pulps. He didn't get a lot of success with the things that he was writing, and so quite a few other successful writers, he would say, well, where can I actually make some money? Where can I land something? And so he did a good bit of mystery writing, sometimes under pseudonyms, some adventure writing, the stuff that he didn't hate, but it wasn't his favorite. And when people asked him about this, he was very down to earth. He said, well, you got to be able to earn a living as a writer, so you take whatever you can. And in 1946, he meets his wife, Norma Ingold, starts writing these stories and novels for Ellery Queen. Some of you may know that mystery. It's not a mystery author because a whole bunch of people wrote under Ellery Queen. Sort of. I guess what would you call it? Like a consortium or a stable of ghostwriters? Hacks. Yeah. I mean, they edited it too. So.
The Hardy Boys, they weren't happy.
Well,
that made by a consortium of art.
I wonder. This is totally off topic, but one of the series that I read a lot as a kid was Tom Swift, and I don't remember who wrote it, but I wonder if it was the same sort of deal where it was like a whole bunch of people churning these stories out. Because, that must have been a big thing back then.
My son had all this Tom Swift's, because the minute the new one would come out, I'd have to go flip.
Yeah, well, where I grew up out in Wales, and we'd go to the Delafield Public Library, and they had a whole shelf of these things, and so I just read my way through them over the course of a summer, and they're all basically the same story. Tom invents something. I think it was the Burgundians were the bad guys or something like that. It was some weird name, and they were supposed to be the Russians. They'd steal it. He and his friend Bud would go and get it back, and Bud would punch somebody, and that was pretty much it, And Vance had to write some stuff like that here and there. But he keeps on writing, and he's sending things to different pulps. He does get connected with John Campbell, and being connected with him was pretty important back then because he was a major editor. He did land a few more with Campbell, but Campbell didn't really like Vance. And as a matter of fact, I haven't read this, but apparently the correspondence between them is really something to check out, because Vance was not happy about having his stories turned down. So I'll have to check that out sometime. He starts writing these other stories, the Magnus Rudolph series for Startling Stories. They open a ceramic shop for a little while, then they close it. And the Magnus Rudolph stories are going to become useful later on, as we'll see. And then Damon Knight is somebody who he connects with, and another major figure in the editorial process of speculative fiction. And he buys 3 of Vance's stories, and then he asks Vance, hey, we've got a book series coming up. Do you have a book? And the answer, if anybody ever asks you, do you have a book, you got to be able to say yes, even if you don't actually have a book. And so that was the first of the books of the Dying Earth. It's a fix-up. Right? We've talked about the fix-up genre. You take a bunch of stories, put them together, and say, there's my book. A. Van Vogt was somebody who did a lot of those, but some of the other authors that we've looked at were too. And so The Dying Earth comes out, and then something really interesting happens. 21st Century Fox buys the film rights to this story, Hard Luck Diggings, and they hire Vance as a scriptwriter. So the Vances moved to Hollywood, and apparently the movie turns out terribly. Nothing goes right, but they get their money up front, which is also very smart as well. And then after that is over with, they go to Europe. They start traveling around, and they stay in Europe until the money runs out, and then they come back, and then he starts looking for more work. And he takes a script writing job, and I did find some interesting things about this Captain Video and his Video Rangers. So I don't know anything about this show, and I'm sure there's probably some footage of it out there somewhere. But apparently it was a show that had been steadily declining in quality. And this is in the very early years of television. So you've got to imagine it probably started out okay and then just started going completely downhill. And it wasn't just Vance who was brought in to work on this. Arthur Clarke was brought in to work on it too. And Isaac Asimov was as well, and a few other authors, and they thought, well, we'll just throw these sci-fi guys at it, and it'll turn out good. And it didn't. I guess it didn't work at all. But one of the things that did happen because of that was he was contacted by, at that time, a local newspaper reporter, Frank Herbert, right, the Dune guy, before he wrote Dune, and they become really close friends, and they and Paul Anderson would travel around and go to Mexico, and this whole really interesting story gets started with them. The Vances then move with the Herberts to a house in Mexico, trying to establish a writers' colony. And apparently they were very rigorous about it. The kids had to shut up from a certain time of the day to a certain time of the day, or get out of the house so that the writers could be doing their writerly job. And they didn't have kids at that time. They were talking about the Herbert's kids. And then they come back, and notice he's starting to publish some of his sci-fi books. I don't have any of the mystery or non-sci-fi, non-fantasy books in this listing. He had quite a few other ones. They buy some lots and a house in the hills east of Oakland, out in the countryside. And apparently it was not a very good house when they bought it. It was pretty run down. It was very small. And for about the next 20 years or so, people said Vance was constantly engaged in one project or another, like building an extension on it, or redoing the floors or fixing the roof. And he also had bad eyesight, so he'd have to be really close to what he was working on in order to do it. But he was constantly puttering away at the house. He has a son who's born, and then in 1962, so now we're talking quite a bit later, he and Frank Herbert and Paul Anderson decide that they want to build a houseboat. Not buy a houseboat, build a houseboat. And it's not going to be like a little houseboat. It's going to be, I think it was something like 14 by 36 feet. So that's a pretty sizable boat. And they start working on it, and everything goes wrong. And eventually, some of them lose heart, but they do finally get it to launch. The first time that it launches, it actually, I think if I remember right, sinks. But they stick with it, and they manage to use it for some things. And around that time, he starts to get some recognition. He wins a Hugo Award for a short story, The Dragon Masters. He'll win some other Hugo Awards later on for The Last Castle, and he starts publishing novels as Ellery Queen. And then notice the productivity after that. He's starting to churn out books. And the Vances would do something really interesting that his son, John Jr., talks about. He said, this is his own words, they traveled often to exotic locales, Madeira, Tahiti, Cape Town, Kashmir. They would settle in cheap lodgings long enough for Vance to write another book. And he said, we'd hole up for anywhere from a couple of weeks to a few months. He had his clipboard. She had the portable typewriter because his wife was part of the writing process. And he'd write in longhand, and then she'd type it up, first draft, second draft, third draft. And so he'd churn out books. And apparently he was quite good at doing that. And so the son went all over the place. As a matter of fact, he's got another story about having, when Arthur C. Clarke was living in Sri Lanka, they stayed with Clarke, and Clarke had to go and find tutors for the boy so he could continue his education. Must have been quite a way to live. And then, he's by the time that we get into the 70s, he's making enough money to be comfortable as an author. He doesn't have a hard Scrabble existence. But, he's 60 years old by that time. Moving into his 60s, right? Born in 1916. So, moving into that. And they start publishing these deluxe, limited hardcover, and I should have put signed editions of works by important sci-fi and fantasy writers. And these two guys who do this project, they choose The Dying Earth as their first book. So that brings this back onto the scene. And, they start selling these very nice volumes with a little signature by Jack Vance that I imagine are probably worth quite a bit of money these days. I don't know, I've never seen one myself. But
which ones are you talking about?
These are by Tim Underwood and Chuck Miller.
Oh, yeah, I have a lot of them.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yes, many.
That would be very interesting.
I met Underwood and Miller at a science fiction meeting.
So what was the idea behind this whole series then?
Well, he was very popular, and they just wanted to make money. And they were illustrated, some of them very nicely.
Okay.
And they were always limited signed edition, and then the rest, but they were always limited anyway.
So these guys were primarily interested in
they
just
published other
making...
things besides Vance.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they split and continued. They still do it.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Oh,
interesting. Yeah, I guess there must be quite a good market for doing that sort of thing.
People collect them, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm sort of at the other end. I'm very utilitarian about these sorts of things, I have to admit. So continuing on with this, one of the things that happens, unfortunately, to Vance is, his eyesight had been bad to begin with. And he starts going to this doctor who's doing laser surgery, and each operation seems to be fixing it, but actually makes it worse. And by the end, when he says, no more, he's effectively blind. So for an author, that's kind of a big problem. But he's able to work by dictation for the books that come after that. There's other people. One of the guy who I wrote my dissertation on had to do that himself, Maurice Blondel. He had a secretary who would take dictation. Somebody actually created a computer program to do it for him. He starts writing more things, and he comes back to the Dying Earth stuff in 83 and 84 with the last two books, Cudgel's Saga and Rialto the Marvelous. And you notice he's starting to get more and more recognition by this time. He's inducted into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. He's a Grand Master. And his production starts to taper off, as I think quite understandable. Eventually, before he dies, his own wife dies, and then there's a couple other things that happen in terms of his publication. There's an integral edition of Vance's works, fan-funded, 45-volume set of his complete works that comes out. First one is in 1999, and then in 2012, now that we have the internet. Going very strongly, Spatterlight Press, named after one of the scales discussed in one of his stories, begins publication of free ebooks, and so that's something that's out there. He dies of what his son calls complications of old age in his home. I think once you're that old, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And he leaves behind this massive legacy, but he's still kind of, I think, in the sci-fi and fantasy world. I guess you could say he's still a bit undervalued compared to. You'd agree with other authors? Yeah.
But maybe he's not for everybody.
Now, why would you say that?
Well,
because of the style?
I read science fiction all the time, and I gave him some fans. He said, I don't really like humor in my science fiction. For example,
he doesn't like humor.
No, and Vance is very funny.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, and I think also the elaborateness of his prose.
Yeah.
Turns some people off. It's interesting because his books are really page turners.
Yeah.
Even with
once
that,
you get into it,
once you get into it, you can't stop. We just
Yeah.
keep turning them. So that's fascinating. And somebody writing for the New York Times, so maybe 20 years ago, said if he was foreign, he'd win the big prize for literature.
Yeah.
But he's an American, so they didn't give it to him. But they think he's very literary.
Yeah.
And a lot of science fiction, even though it isn't very literary,
yeah.
it's ideas, and that's it.
That's a really interesting observation. That if he'd been a Frenchman or an Italian author or something like that, maybe people would have said, "Oh, this is really so sophisticated."
Yes. yeah. That integral edition was an interesting thing because it was sort of a project of the internet and a new era of being able to communicate with people, and so the people who put this together off of a website that they ran got volunteers to edit.
Okay.
So if you were interested, they'd send you copies of, and then you could edit. And it all had to be approved by Vance and his son because they didn't like the way some editors treated things, so they had the original copies that Vance did.
Yeah.
So it was really a big project. Then they had them bound in Italy, and then the people who were willing to put them in boxes and ship them got free transportation
copies
to Italy to go there and do that.
Interesting. Projects like that are so massive. The only other one that I can think of that's similar in scope is the Bentham transcription project with the works of the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. There, it's not so much editing that the fans or the volunteers are doing. It's just transcribing stuff from his just voluminous writings. And every couple of years or so, they announce that they've got a new book of Bentham coming out. But it takes so getting people to work together. It sounds very easy, but every time you have a big project like that, there's so many snarls and
Well, they pulled it off, 47 volumes, and it's just something. He's also very popular with the Dragons and Dungeons crowd. So
we're going to talk about that.
For a lot of their writing.
Yeah. Now, I know more about the game system itself than about the books that came out with.
I don't know anything about it, really. I just know
what I
told you.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the world then that he builds, this dying Earth. So it's a dying Earth because it's a dying sun. It's very, very far off. He talks in terms of aeons, and the sun is red now. The sky is sometimes deep blue, sometimes pink. A lot of things have changed since the young present that we live in. So cities have risen and fallen and have new cities built upon them, and they've become great empires and then fallen and disappeared. Humankind is kind of a small population. I guess usually the world is described as neo-medieval, but we'd have to expand beyond European medieval things and think about like the entire Islamic world as well. I think you could say is being mined for ideas from this. Other people describe it as Baroque, and it is Baroque, but not in the sense of the time period that we're thinking about. It's more the prose and the ways in which people are doing things, and there's no unifying theme or set of customs or anything that ties all of humanity together in this. There is something that is kind of curious, which is that there's one single monetary system, the terse, right? And you wonder how that's able to continue on, but it is. And it's never explained exactly how much longer the Earth has to live. It could be, some people talk about it, the sun could go out tomorrow. Other people think it'll go on for thousands of years into the future. And most of the world is, in effect, back to the wild or wasteland, including areas that used to be very important. And a lot of institutions, like there's a museum for man that plays an important role in these stories. That's in ruins, essentially. There's all sorts of fantastic creatures. some of them are very dangerous, others just kind of humorous, and there's also ghosts and demons and other worlds. And that's an important aspect, I think, of the world that he's building as well. There's the possibility of going back and forth in time, but there's also the possibility of connecting up with other, you could call them dimensions or worlds or whatever you want. There is a sort of, what should we call, vertical dimension to this. There's the overworld, which we'll talk about in a bit, and then there's all these demon worlds beneath, and then the world of humanity is in between. But there's all sorts of other worlds that you can connect up with, which some of them are good places, and some of them are not so good, and some are quite boring in a way. He talks about one which is empty except for a moaning sound, for example. So imagine getting stuck there. And there's never any sort of like rhyme or reason laid out for them. They're just talked about as, well, this magical spell or this object will get you into that world and make that possible. But those are in effect part of his narrative universe. So does his narrative universe actually have, and this would be a good question to open up for big discussion, does it have some sort of consistent rules or order to it, or is it just kind of people muddle along and make things up as best as they can? What do you guys think? Those of you who read a lot of Vance, would you say that there's some sort of unifying order?
I haven't read a lot of Vance.
Oh, okay. Well,
I'm out of this one.
Well, you two.
Yeah.
What do you guys think? Is there some sort of discernible logic to it?
The diner, and in setting, he seems to be pretty consistent. Like, he develops the world and he keeps putting things in it. I'm actually browsing his Wikipedia article.
Yeah.
It looks like his science fiction stories were also set all in the same rough setting. He returned to certain planets a couple of times, like with the Alice story novels.
Yeah.
So it seemed like once he put that work in, he wanted.
I mean, I guess you could say that once he's created something, then the next land over, there's going to be some sort of connection to it, right? You could map out the things. What would you say?
There's something behind this. The basis of it is actually science fiction.
Yeah.
It reads like fantasy, but the Earth is really old.
Yeah.
And lots of things have happened. Planets have been visited. Some of the people on Earth aren't people, they're aliens. Alien people. Some of these creatures came from other planets. Some of them were created in labs. And they have their own life now, they're a species of sorts. So this is all the long history, and he can just reach back and say, well, this happened then in the 13th Aeon, and nobody really remembers too much about it, but that's where they were started.
Yeah.
And so that he can say anything. And there's another universe he has besides the Dying Earth universe. It's called the Gaian Reach. And that's where most of the more recent science fiction takes place.
Okay.
So the stories there, some of them are linked. People cross over from one book to the other in some sense.
Yeah.
In the Gaian Reach.
So there is a universe or a cosmos with order, you could say, right? But
well, I would say that yes. If you read them all and think about them, you'll see that there's references to things that are actually science.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like science because this is the culture of the day, and this is the way people think and work. And although the magic seems like some kind of supernatural, it's actually based on science.
Yeah.
And these other these other worlds those are actual places that exist, all right. But we just don't know about them today.
Well, that is a great segue into one of the themes that I was going to discuss later. But let's jump into it and talk about it now. You could call it the magic system, and yeah, there's a discussion very early on in the very first story about the nature of magic, that it is a science. It's ultimately based on mathematics of some sort. Now, what sort of mathematics? I would have a hard time thinking of that. I studied mathematics as well as philosophy, and in college, and he and L. Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt, when they're discussing the mathematics involved in their Harold Shea stories, it's hard to figure out exactly what they would have in mind. But it is tied in with that sort of idea that goes all the way back to the Pythagoreans, and then you see coming up with Descartes again, that if you really see the mathematical structures of things, you could manipulate the forces of the universe and understand it. Now, in the Dying Earth, they've forgotten most of the spells that were available. So, it's kind of funny the way that Vance depicts it. And the wizards use magic primarily by memorizing these lengthy formulas. They sort of like clear out a space in their head, fill it up with the magical stuff, and then recite it, and then it works a certain thing. Kujal is terrible at doing that. He in the few times that he uses magic, he says something wrong and screws something up. But the other wizards seem to be able to do that. They also have a lot of different objects that have magic, and somehow they've been invested with that. And Gary Gygax, he did in fact write quite a bit about Vance, and he actually tried to get him to come to Gen Con. But at that time, Vance's speaker's fee was too high to afford it when it was just starting out. I mean, I think if he would have kept at it, he probably could have done it later on. And the magic system in Dungeons and Dragons, which was really it's not the only major role-playing system at the time. There was another one that was called, there's a book that you can find every once in a while called Fantasy Wargaming, and it dates to about the same time, and it has a system as well. But Gygax was developing, first it was with tabletop miniatures, and then they started doing the role-playing aspect of it. And when they started thinking about magic, and there's one other thing too that Gygax said he drew from Vance. I should mention that as well. The entire notion of so in Dungeons and Dragons, you have to pick out what kind of person you're going to be, right? You're a fighter, you're a magic user, you're a cleric, or you're a thief. That was what the original 4 classes were, and you had to pick what do you want your character to be like. And fighters go around beating everybody up and killing monsters with swords or axes, and clerics, cast spells, but they're spells to heal people, or they have a connection with the deity. Magic users are the wizards or the mages, or whatever you want to call them. And then the thieves are the people who go around and they don't just steal things, they figure out how to undo traps, and they're good at sneaking, and they can do all that sort of stuff. And Gygax said that Kujal was one of the main sources of inspiration for that. So that, and also a few things like the Hobbits and the Lord of the Rings, But going back to the magic system, so Gygax wrote something really interesting in an article that he wrote in Strategic Review in 76, and he's talking about types of magic, and he said there's 4 basic types of magic, and I think he means in fantasy narrative. So there's systems which require long conjuration with much paraphernalia as an adjunct, like those used in Shakespeare and Macbeth, or typically written about by Robert E. Howard in his Conan stories. So that's one kind. And then there's the relatively short spoken spell, as in Finnish mythology, like in the Kalevala, or found in the superb, as he said, superb fantasy of Jack Vance. That's the second. The third is ultra-powerful, if not always correct, magic, typical of de Camp and Pratt in their classic Harold Shea stories. And then he said, the generally weak and relatively ineffectual magic as found in J.R.R. Tolkien's work. Now, you think about, is all the magic in Tolkien's work like that? When Sauron makes the ring, maybe not, right? But for the most part, the magic that they're doing, compared to the magic that's happening here or in the Harold Shea stories, is kind of small, isn't it? And he said that he had to make a decision when he was putting together D&D. What kind of magic would it be? Whose would it resemble? And so he chose the Vancian system. And that's what you were talking about earlier. And so for everybody who started playing Dungeons and Dragons from like the 1970s on, they were in effect, whether they realized it or not, using a set of ideas that came from these stories. Not the only thing. He mentions the Kalevala, that sort of thing is happening as well. But so Gygax, he calls it the Vancian system. And it's interesting. I remember when I was a kid, I was fascinated with D&D. It was very difficult to find people to play with living out in the country, But when you did play, you would, and you'd spend a lot of time reading these books that Gary Gygax wrote, the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player Manual, and he had these little chapters where he'd talk about what he was trying to do in creating this, what his logic was behind it. And he also had a section where he had reading recommendations. And he said, if you really want to be a good dungeon master, you need to be literate in fantasy literature. And Vance was one of the people that he recommended. Fritz Leiber was another. Of course, Robert Howard with the Conan stories. And there were a whole bunch of other people. But then he if I remember right, I haven't looked at this stuff since I was a kid, he said, I like this aspect from this person, this aspect from this person, this aspect from this person. So Vance, really, if you think about influence, D&D is not the only role-playing game, but it's probably the biggest, and it's sort of like saying, the U.S. isn't the only military, but what we decide to do influences every other military, right? What happened with D&D, where magic plays an absolutely central role, arguably influenced all the other developments of face-to-face role-playing games, and then through that, all the computer, multiplayer role-playing games that people are playing. This whole notion of how spells should work.
Well, Vance had a couple spin-off writers, too, that liked his work and wrote in his universes. One is Michael Shea,
Yeah.
The Dying Earth.
Yeah.
And there's another one named Matthew, who's a Canadian, and he wrote in The Gang and Reach.
Okay.
And he wrote maybe 5-6 novels. They're very good.
Wow.
All of them are good. Shea's too.
I haven't read either one of them. That would be something interesting to follow up. Did Shea write a lot of other stuff? Or
Michael Shea, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think he just did Vance stuff. That I know of anyway.
Okay.
But that was the main stuff that he did. He had a character like Kugel, and he went around and got in trouble. And
What was his name, the character? Do you know offhand? Or?
I don't remember. I haven't read one for a long time. I've got some little paperbacks. I'll give you one.
Okay. Yeah, that would be fun to check out.
Yeah.
So the magic system is something, it's a very important part of the books. Actually, now that we're talking about roguish characters, that was another theme I wanted to bring up was, is Kujal and some of the other characters in here, are they ethical or are they just simply amoral? There's
There's
not
no ethics behind it except self-serving.
Yeah.
Yeah, all they're really about is getting by and doing whatever is pleasurable in their day.
Yeah, so I think that takes it a little bit beyond just the only what serves the self. There's a kind of and it's not asceticism because Kujal's willing to be happy with whatever comes along, right? He's not finicky about things too much the way some of the other characters are,
He might like putting one over on people, and he likes getting away with it. That he values very highly, as well as the wealth that he gets from his activities.
He's always in the stories. The money is coming quickly, and then he loses it almost all the time.
Very adept.
Yeah. Do you think that he really does enjoy the act of tricking people or getting one
seems
over?
like it to me. It's interpreted. You can think of it another way. I think he gets a kick out of it. Sure.
There's a line in one of the stories where somebody asks him, "Is this the conduct of a sly and unpredictable villain?" And he says, "Decidedly so. If the villain, for the purposes of his joke, thinks to simulate the altruist, the person who's other-oriented, who's trying to help other people." And then the other guy says, "Well, how would you know the villain from the altruist then?" And then it says, "Kujal shrugged it is not an important distinction.
Yeah.
So, now what about the other characters in here? They definitely have motives. Some of them seem to be, some of them are clearly bad characters. They intend harm to other people. A few of them seem to be pretty altruistic. They offer cudgel.
Altruistic?
What's that?
Which ones are altruistic?
I'm thinking of they're not purely altruistic, right? There's usually some sort of deal being struck, but the guy, and I forget his name, he's willing to pull fast ones on people too. There's a story where there is a guy and he builds these platforms for the men in the village to sit on, and you want to have your platforms as high as possible. And they're associating it with like healthful living, but it's really about being more important than the other people, right? And the women will do just about anything to get the stonecutter, who has what he thinks is a magical amulet. It's really the boots that have the magic, because the boots have a special wax that's put on them. You kick the stone or kick anything else, and it like floats. The weight is taken from it. And so he's been able to, he's the last of a series of stonecutters who are able to, establish themselves in that town. And so the women are like, making him food and bringing him all sorts of stuff so that he will do his job and make these, these essentially, what would you call them? They're almost like rungs they're not a ladder. They're just pieces that you put together and make a larger tower. Now, when Kugel shows up, he takes him in, and he doesn't put him to work right away. He says, "Here, you can have some food. I've got plenty of it. You can stay the night if you want to." He seems pretty altruistic, doesn't he? Kugel's the one who suggests that he becomes.
They're all out. In these dying earth stories, everybody's out.
Everybody's on the make.
And they're not always good at it, and some of them don't care that much one way or another. But nobody's out for anybody but themselves, or their town. And sometimes
or their religion, right? Yeah.
And that's one of the distinctive features of the dying earth novels. So the other novels aren't like that.
Yeah. So it's a kind of, at best, amoralism running throughout the entire thing.
I would think so, yeah.
Where ethics is...
Very cynical view of human nature, for sure.
Yeah. It's funny.
It's the way everybody speaks, and they sound so serious, and, they're trying to pull one.
Yeah.
I think it's hilarious.
Yeah.
I don't like Kugel. He's not my favorite character.
Why not?
He's just too slimy. I like Rialto. He's not really trying to put it over on people so much as just try to be, the handsomest guy who gets the best women and maybe a better mage than anybody else.
Yeah.
But he's sort of less nasty than the others.
One of the things that got pointed out by some of the commenters about Kugel is that he thinks he's much better with the women and more attractive and a greater lover than he actually is. And I don't remember which story it is, but there's one where the women really lay into him. They say, "Oh, he was terrible. We were just going along with things to get something out of you," and it doesn't bother him. He just continues thinking that he's great anyway. Yeah.
He has some narcissistic tendencies or whatever.
Well, he's not narcissistic in the way that a lot of narcissists are, where they're out of touch with reality, and they can't function very well because they make stupid mistakes, right? He does still make mistakes.
He's highly self-serving, and he doesn't really respond to things that he doesn't agree with, and even is there really any true altruism? That's some of the things I've been thinking about.
Not in him. That's for sure.
No, I mean even in any sense, because even if you're doing it for the best of reasons, you're still getting something from that.
Yeah.
You're still getting something. You're getting some pleasurable aspect from doing something, even for whatever reasons you do it. So there's like really slimy, like apparently you would say this Kujal guy, is there? There's,
Well, there's slimier characters than that yet in some of these stories.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, that another theme I wanted to talk about was, so Earth might be dying, but human beings, the human race, seems to be doing quite well. And I wanted to bring up the idea that, so we often talk about there's human nature, right? And we say there's a common human condition that we all, one way or another, inhabit, or we might say there's some sort of human comedy or drama that we're all playing little roles in. So maybe we don't all have to be exactly the same, but we're all going to die someday. We face up to certain basic constants. And in this story, there's a set of stories. There's all sorts of orientations and occupations depicted or envisioned of the people. They can have different motives. Some are, very into some sort of religious perspective. There's a group that are actually doing something that I guess you could say they think is in some way altruistic. They're beaming energy at the sun. It's not doing anything, of course, but and the other places in the world that are supposed to be doing it, they've all died out or disappeared. But there is this group that's oriented towards beaming things at the sun, and they take that very, very seriously. Their society is organized around that, and there's a bunch of other ones as well. So can we say that? Here's the thing we could think about. So Vance, of course, is in our time. He's imagining something that would be very distant. And is he just projecting our own ideas and categories onto a distant, dying Earth? And we like it in part because we can see something that's similar to other literature, whereas there's other authors who imagine what humanity is going to be like way in the future, and they're like, we couldn't even connect with them. We can't imagine what they would be like.
Yeah, these people are just people, right?
Yeah.
In the future, humans haven't evolved in any sense at all. They're just, just like regular folk, except in, they
different names
trying to pull
and
the wool over everybody else's eyes. Not necessarily, but there's a lot of that. And
yeah,
and that's an interesting thing. People criticized him for that. I don't think there's any point to that because he's not trying to create a realistic far future at all. He's trying to create a humorous
set of stories, right?
Fantasy scenario that sells. And he wanted to sell books, and if you asked him, what do you have a political axe to grind in any of this? He'd say none whatsoever. All I wanted to do was sell books. Yeah.
And he saw that from what I've read of his stuff, he saw that as, he didn't even say that everybody needs to be like that. He just saw that as, that's a great way to be an author. That's a great way to orient yourself. So, I mean, if you compare him against, like, somebody like Clarke, right? You think about childhood's end, where we can't even picture what this overmind is like, and it's the end of the human race. This is something very different than that. This is, like you said, it's people doing the same kind of stuff as they did in our lifetime or did back in the Middle Ages. And we could ask, do we think human beings are going to be like that if we do manage to live into the distant future? I mean, if we don't die out as a race? What do you guys think?
This is the thing, that other thing we're supposed to do with something about something of the new sun.
Oh, Gene Wolfe, yeah.
Yeah, Gene Wolfe. Okay, that was a very similar thing too. That it was, a billion years in the future. And one of the things I brought up too was, why is it that people never change? I mean, all of this goes on, and all of this technology, but then all of a sudden you lose all the technology. Like this sounds like it goes back to medieval, and that was the same thing that Gene Wolfe did. I mean, why is it that you have forgotten everything and you're back to fighting with swords and sticks and doing this kind of nonsense? And humanity has not evolved.
Yeah.
And obviously we are going to evolve. We have always evolved. And we had the discussion before that we may at some point just evolve into like an AI sort of thing, just upload consciousness and become mechanized. Or we could, depending, I mean, if it would go back to such a situation where it was almost medieval, where it was like the Dark Ages, where we lost everything, then we would probably not evolve because our tech would be gone. And
Yeah, there
I
may
don't
be
know how we
certain
would lose
conditions that are required to when you're talking about evolving, you're talking about like society, which is the matrix for the individuals evolving to offer new possibilities. Because, I mean, if you think about what's required in order to have the technology, let's say we were going to upload our consciousnesses, we get past the problem of whether that's possible or not. Think about the sheer infrastructure that's required to make that happen.
There's people alive today that are certain they're themselves are gonna do it, and I mean, that's
Yeah,
not gonna happen,
yeah.
but I mean, it's something that's potential, it's a possibility.
Yeah, so if
Not yet, but
where I'm going with this is if we do evolve, it's going to require a certain degree of like not just stability, but things proceeding along in an
Yes.
orderly manner. And you get the idea that in his view of this, that did happen, but then, give it long enough and things break down sooner or later, And I wonder if that isn't more, I mean, we're here to say that's more accurate. Well, what would be the measure for that? We have to see into the future, right? There it gets very speculative.
well, this, I mean, this all is, I mean, but if you look at things, how they have gone to this point, there has to be some kind of a catalyst that brings it back to the point where you are, going back into the dark ages, like city on top of city on top of city, but your cities are regressing instead of progressing, and your everything else is kind of regressing. Like if you're interplanetary moving around, you obviously have got some ability to do that, but yet at the same time you're still winging a sword. I mean that.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
again, I guess that's a story. If somebody.
A lot of it, I think, it would depend on being able to continually harness energy, right? And being able to rely upon that to keep everything going. We're going to sooner or later have to shift away from fossil fuels because although we keep finding new deposits of them, sooner or later we're going to run out.
Well, actually,
right?
there are quite a few, but the planet won't survive the
Oh, the use of them, yeah,
yes,
yeah.
I mean, the planet will die before we run out of fossil fuels. That's just basically.
Well, that's good news.
Yeah, if you want to die soon, yes.
But yeah, in order to I mean, sci-fi people always solve this by just having some new energy source or explaining it away. But if we think about how it would have to happen for us, in order to have the evolution, in order to supply all that computing power. I mean, think about how much electricity is consumed just with these server farms that we have to ship our Amazon products. I think the prospects of having some sort of future where we would all be uploaded into the cloud would probably take more than that.
Well, yes, I mean, I said this would be,
Yeah.
you'd almost have to get to the cold fusion level, which they
Yeah,
have.
yeah,
To do that, or, you'd have to start using something like the sun or some kind of a fusion level to get that level of energy.
And if we don't, then maybe we do end up having a shift back into older formats. I mean, what we're seeing with wealth inequality in our own time is sort of a regression to the mean. The here in the United States, we had a great, after the World War II, we had a great, boom period where standards of living were increasing, pretty much across the board, and then we hit a peak, and it started going down with Generation X. It became more difficult for them to pay for schooling, buy a house. And now we're seeing more difficulties for the newer generation, and I think in part this was very far afield now of the original discussion, but what we're seeing is a reversion back to the mean, because that's the way it is in most societies through history. We have these incredibly stratified societies. We had a nice honeymoon period, I guess, of 40, 50 years, and it doesn't look like we managed to use it all that well in a way that would make it sustainable. So now maybe we're moving back to those sort of things, which is not good.
Yeah,
But
no, I mean, a little bit is supposed to, but I mean, one cyber virus could take out everything. I mean, somebody
Oh,
could
true.
and because everything,
Well-
we're told everything's connected on the dang web, so that would bring us to dark ages, that would.
yeah, another thing that could really screw us up.
Nothing worse than
and
that.
you do see like horror people exploring this. Just a really bad pandemic, because you think about what's required in order to maintain the current level of activity that we have. You don't just need all the massive amounts of technology and energy consumption. We are pretty labor intensive. We still do need a lot of human beings,
World War
at least
Z?
pushing buttons. Well, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a zombie thing. It could
No,
be.
I mean, just when so many people died, I mean, it just was like,
Yeah.
they wouldn't be all these zombies, but just so many people were gone. Yeah.
If you think about, like, let's say, you take some of the major diseases that we have, and let's say you boosted them up a bit, and they became, if they're viruses, they're resistant to all the antivirals that are out there, and they hit the sort of sweet spot, because in order to have a really good pandemic, and good in the sense of like being able to spread, it can't be so deadly that it kills all the hosts like that. That's one problem with like Ebola, for example. If you kill all the hosts right away, you can't spread very far. That's why like things like cholera or the Black Death, these things that originally come out of the Indian subcontinent, once they really became deadly, they didn't kill all the population, but they killed enough of the population to bring things to a halt in many respects. And if we had something like that with our incredibly technology-dependent civilization, what would we do? Would we just like use machines to supplement all the people?
No, yeah. We're already kind of there. I could tell you stuff that would make you want to shoot yourself tonight. But they've already discovered CRE in Europe, and it's going to head over here. And when this is colostrum-resistant E. coli, and by the time that bacteria, there will be no antibiotic that will be able to treat anything. So people will die from cutting their fingers on a knife. I mean, there'll be no absolute, and this is already appearing, and so there's a good possibility if they don't.
Well, that'll be like a reversion to the norm, the way it was for most humans. I mean, warfare throughout most of history, a lot of the casualties came because of wounds that became infected, or just stubbing your toe, or
well, we could go back to that without
bad food.
antibiotics. It would be a world like prior to that, which would be.
I just read that 70% of the people that died, men that died, that were fighting in the Civil War, died of disease.
Yeah.
I also heard a thing on the BBC earlier this morning about bacterial resistance to antibiotics and how many.
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, right. There's a lot now that are there, and they're not controllable.
Nope.
I mean, they're not controllable by antibiotics.
Yeah.
And that is. God, you got to get up early for that BBC. I do. I work the polls, so I have to get up at 5 o'clock to get ready. So the only thing that's ever on the radio is the BBC. So I'm listening to that.
Yeah.
That's really early in the morning. Or late at night, I suppose you could do.
One of the other themes that I'd wanted to talk about was I called it sort of just taking perspective, and perspectives play an important role in a lot of these stories. And the idea is that maybe the perspectives can create the world that you're living in, or at least the experiences that you have, right? So the entire first Cudgel book is about trying to get these eyepieces that let you see. They're called the eyes of the overworld. They let you see this world in terms of the overworld. And so you could, and they don't just affect your vision, they affect like all your sensorium. So you can eat crappy food and think that you're dining on wonderful stuff. You could hear terrible screeching and think you're hearing beautiful music. You could be like rolling around on marbles and think that you're getting a wonderful massage or whatever else is going on. And one of the people who is experiencing this Kugel's talking to him, and he says, "Yes, I realize I see but a semblance, but so do you, and who's to say which one is real?" The idea is, if it's real for you, if you're experiencing it, isn't that just as good as being in the real world and experiencing the things there? So that I think that's one important way that he's playing around with this idea, and everybody wants to get their hands on these glasses because it's almost like a drug, right? It makes your reality so much better.
Drugs are really good point.
Yeah.
Think about people who are also, somewhere else mentally.
Yeah.
They live in a different world. They need drugs. I don't know.
There's
he's talking about that or not.
There are some characters like that in these stories. They usually tend to be the ones that are into philosophy or religion. Like there's that guy who on this caravan, he's constantly talking about the different infinities all coming together in this one place, and you should contemplate that. And then everybody else is like, "Well, you're no fun to drink with," He's like, "Well, I'm not supposed to be fun to drink with. I'm doing something better." Another one of the very first story has a creature in it, a woman who was created in a vat, and there was her brain got screwed up somehow, and then she has her own story later on, and she sees the universe in a way different than we do. Everything looks disgusting to her. Everything looks horrifying, and she's filled with just sort of hatred and rage and wants to kill everybody and destroy everything. And I think she's one of the most interesting characters because she's able to find out that her way of looking at things is actually wrong, that she's out of touch with reality, even though she's experiencing something terrible all the time. So she'd look at us around the table and she'd be like, "Look at those ghouls or goblins," and then she's got a sword and she'd probably try to kill all of us. Or this light is a sickly light, and she changes over time. She's trying to find beauty in a world that she knows beauty exists, but she can't see it. And I think it's a fascinating character, in part because of the self-consciousness of that. If she didn't know and she was just like on the hunt trying to kill things, she wouldn't be quite so interesting.
Well, they create another one.
Yeah, one who's
she's more like the rest of us, and they meet.
Do you think that? Yeah, you're right. Do you think that she needs to hear? She needs somebody being like her enough to be able to hear that message.
About that, and the thing is that she almost killed her, and if she had killed her, she'd have
been stuck in the same dynamic. Yeah.
Before, but somehow someone was able to live long enough to convince her that there's another way to see things.
Yeah.
And she really worked at it because she was miserable.
Yeah.
It's a really good story.
Yeah. Another thing that came up in another story, again in the first book, is this guy is asking an augur about fees. And the augur said, "I respond to 3 questions. For 20 terces, I phrase the answer in clear and actionable language. For 10, I use the language of cant, which occasionally admits of ambiguity. For 5, I speak a parable, which you must interpret as you will. And for 1 terce, I babble in an unknown tongue." Now we're not talking about like visual perception now, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about how people learn about the world. And I think it's fascinating that, so he knows what somebody's future is or what they ought to do, right? And he's willing to share it with you, and if you pay the full price, if you get the gold package, as we often say, right, then you get clear and actionable language.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Well, Vance is really not too pro-religion.
No.
Anywhere in any
Yeah.
of his books, and it's pretty clear in this one.
Yeah, there's one god. I can only think of one case where a god does something genuinely good, and it's that God who's totally just, right? He gives everybody justice, and so he gives this guy his face back that his witchy ex-wife or paramour had taken away through her sorcery, and then gives her a terrible look herself. But all the other gods are either they don't care about human beings, or they're kind of, they almost look like demons, or, and then their followers are just as bad. Some of them, don't believe in any of the stuff that they're spouting, and the ones that do are almost worse. Right?
Now, one of the things I thought was interesting about his stories is, and this is all throughout his writing, is that people travel, and when they go places, they don't know what they're going to run into, and it's a very awkward and uncomfortable and even dangerous possible situation, and the people that they meet take advantage of them. They don't know.
Yeah.
So there's always this dilemma. So when people
like a negotiation
as they
going on.
travel, there's this very humorous, usually, negotiation about how to get lodging and how to get what you're looking for and how to find directions. And the people say, well, our customs, we might not be able to tell you everything you want to know, but why don't you stay the night, and then you find out they're the next day's sacrifice.
Yeah.
That's typical of his stories.
There's another great one too, where he stays in a town. He's trying to get back to where he's supposed to be originally, and he stays in this town, and they say, there's this tower, and the keeper of the tower just died today. His place is open, and wow, he lives this wonderful life. Eats the best food, sleeps with anybody he wants to. And they talk it up so much, and so Cudgel's like, well, could I apply for the job? And so he does, and once he gets up in the tower, they pull the rope down, and they give him really crappy food when they give him any food.
Yeah. He gets his revenge.
Yeah. Well, you're right, he always gets some revenge, right? I guess Cudgel himself and some of the others, they also, they create perspectives through words. They get one over on people, don't they? Mm-hmm. By creating the prospect of greater gain or comfort or pleasure, ease, or whatever else that people are driven by.
Yes, that's right. People are driven by something, and they
once you figure out what it is,
advantage, and then they get their comeuppance. But he's not that good at it. He usually gets his too. Yeah, he's quite the character.
Yeah. So that's all that I actually had in terms of themes. What else really struck those of you who've read these stories? What else do you think, in terms of philosophical themes, in a broad sense, needs to be brought up? Is there anything that you think is missing, or?
I'm trying to think if we've already discussed some of it, but the other aspect of the Dying Earth, that things are winding down and sort of the logic of the universe is changing. And I'm sort of influenced by reading other people who were influenced by Vance, who really focused on that changing point where you go from a logic and technology based.
So let me ask this: is it changing in the sense of like it's moving from one workable configuration to another workable configuration, or is it more like a decline where there is originally a logic, an order, a structure, and now it's breaking down, and there's a lot of gaps, and things don't fit together that well, and anybody can kind of take advantage when they want? Is it the one, or is it the other, would you say?
The thing I'm remembering right now was not written by Vance. It was sort of a fan work, but it had focused on how logic and technology actually stopped working. It's an interesting series because
stopped working totally?
Sporadically, intermittently, slowly failing.
Okay.
So it's decaying. The protagonist is actually a private investigator.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. He would find people who were taking advantages of glitches in the system to do things.
Was that Matthew Hughes?
Probably, now that you mention it.
Yes, he's one of the Vance spin-offs. He's really good. Those are good. Yes, in his universe, that's what happens. That there are phases of logic and science, and then there are phases of magic and irrationality, and they alternate. And when one is going and the other is coming, people get caught in the middle, and it's very interesting. The stories are based on that.
How long do the cycles go on for? Where it's magic and irrationality, generations?
They're pretty long, and if you're going through one, you're not going to go through one again, and you probably won't remember. You'd have written legends of the last time it happened. So.
Those are Matthew Hughes stories.
Okay.
Well, that theory kind of explains how you get from where we are to where that is. I mean, that sort of, philosophy would explain that.
Yeah, but in that case, it's specifically the metaphysics itself is changing.
Interesting. I think, if I remember right, Roger Zelazny has a story where, order completely is broken down. The main character is all ticked off about it because he can't, things just start floating, and he's trying to restore order to things, and the good news is that the agents of chaos, they can't actually get it together to stop him, because
Is there a series?
well,
Is there
there,
a long-running
well,
series?
there's the Chronicles of Amber, right?
Yeah, that's not
you
that
could
one, right?
no, there's a short story of his, but I mean, you could say the Chronicles of Amber are also dealing with that same problematic, right? It's this conflict between Amber representing order and chaos, which was there before Amber, and then what happens after the pattern's been destroyed. And when we discussed that one, that was in the first year. I talked about it in terms of Neoplatonism and the idea of emanation of order and structure outward from, in that case, the pattern, but for the Neoplatonists, the one, the thing. And in that one, you have a character who, after the pattern has been wrecked, his way of fixing things is to create a new pattern, which introduces a third aspect, a third element, right, between order and chaos. Doesn't turn out to be completely a stable resolution, though. And then he writes another 5 volumes. After that.
I really got tired of going through that chaos. Oh, it's so
Yeah.
But they were good anyway. I read them all
Yeah, they were good.
years ago.
I think the first 5 were probably better than the last 5. You guys might see. Yeah. Well, anything else you guys want to say about Vance or anything else?
He went when the Science Fiction Channel was really doing science fiction.
Oh,
they had
yeah.
reports from conventions.
Yeah.
So Vance got the Grand Master Award, and they had a little 5-minute spiel on what was going on, and there he was standing there, and he said, "It's about time." Pretty arrogant. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you met him, I met him. I went to see him for the World Fantasy Award, or one of those anyway in the '80s.
Yeah.
And he's just really a nice guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Down to earth.
And he told us, we had everybody wanted to know how to pronounce Cugel.
What did he say?
Kugel.
Okay.
But he said, "I think." So use your own judgment. That's what he said.
That's great.
Yeah, it was worth going.
Yeah. How long did you get to talk with him?
Well, pretty long actually, and because I was an anthropologist, and in those days I was an anthropologist.
Okay.
He's very interested in anthropology, and there's a lot of anthropology in here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of culture, conflict, and a lot of, he doesn't go on and bore you with details. He gives you the major stuff that you need to know for the story, and that's what I like about it. And it's just enough. Like that Cherry that you read, was that last week?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, or last month.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tried some of hers, and she just goes, and it's like reading an ethnography, and I'm out of that, So, but Vance knows how to tell you in a way that things are different culturally, and it isn't boring, and it's usually got some humor attached. Well, so what was I saying? Oh, he wanted to talk to me.
Yeah.
Because of that, he wrote a book about language, about the idea that language is influencing how we see things. And it's called, there are a couple of scholars behind it called Sapir-Whorf.
Yeah, the Sapir-Whorf
hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf theory, and so he wrote The Languages of Power.
That's right,
And he wanted to talk to me about that, and I was really interested. But it wasn't my field, and it was over my head, and then he said, "Why don't you come out to San Francisco there with my wife?" And I thought, I don't think so. I'm chicken out. I wish I'd gone. Oh, he was really a great guy.
That's great.
Yeah, so we talked to him for a long time, and he was pretty blind, but he worked with a big computer screen then. So he had, the letters were like this, and he could see that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so he sat there and typed, and he could see that.
Well, I had the idea that he was legally blind, and that he...
Yeah, well, he was, he couldn't see anything, really from over there. He couldn't see over there. But, he could see right in front of him, and that's how he used that screen. So
Okay.
he was like really nearsighted, I guess, and very obese, and but such a fan base. Like, you know, you wouldn't believe that people are so
Ardent
loyal.
about him? Yeah.
But they all say Vance isn't for everybody. I don't know if it's an elite. I don't know.
Well, I think that's quite right. That is a great story to end on. So thanks for bringing that up. You know, it's not often that.
I brought you something else to see.
Really?
Yeah, I did. I thought, well, right now I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a book dealer, and I have.
Where do you work? Where's your store?
I don't have a store. I sell online and in antique malls, but
Okay.
you know, that's neither here nor there. I collect Vance, you know, and I have for a long time. So this book is very fragile. And in the 1990s and further, this was the most expensive paperback you could buy if you
Really?
collected paperbacks.
That is really
Yeah,
cool.
just be careful with that.
Do you mind if I take a picture?